iDS Talks is a podcast dedicated to helping corporations and law firms find new and effective ways to leverage data, giving them a decisive advantage both in and out of the courtroom.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of iDS Talks. My name is Jonathan Sachs, Chief Revenue Officer at iDS, and I'm joined today by Bill Taylor, Director of iDS's Investigations Service offering. We're here today to talk about the crucial role of data in corporate investigations. Welcome to today's podcast, Bill.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's very nice to be here.
Yeah, and this is not our first rodeo together. We may have some first-time listeners, so they will probably hear some inside comments or references made. I'll try to include them in our fun, Bill. But I feel like I needed to put that disclaimer out there on this particular podcast.
Just keep it civil, Jonathan.
It's of course. All right, let's jump right in. Right, we're talking about corporate investigations today, and I'd like to start with us establishing a baseline understanding of what corporate investigations can include.
So I think it's good to maybe even talk about something more basic, which is, what is a corporate investigation, right? What we're talking about here is corporate internal investigations, the object of which is to address potential wrongdoing by company employees in violation of company policies, potentially in violation of law or regulation, in order to address that wrongdoing, to take appropriate disciplinary action against anybody who may be involved in policy or law violations, to remediate compliance and ethics programs that did not work to prevent that activity to begin with, and potentially to address regulators who may be investigating that conduct in order to win the best outcome for the company.
Yeah. So it can be a lot.
It can be a lot. And but understanding sort of what the functional goal is of those investigations is important, because the next step is to talk about what those investigations look like. And those investigations involve, by definition, the identification and preservation of potentially relevant evidence in the form of documents and electronically stored information. It involves potentially interviewing company employees as witnesses, potentially involving third parties in interviews outside, gathering information from those third parties, and it potentially involves talking to government agents or agencies that may be investigating the company or analyzing the company's compliance with this regulatory overburden.
Got it. Well, I think you've sort of answered the first part of my next question. So I had a two-parter for you.
Okay.
So I'm going to still ask both parts, and you'll probably restate a little bit of what you said. But the first part is, and you said this, corporate investigations involve data. But the reality of today is that there is so much data that's created by the corporation, by its employees. So can you walk us through some of the different types of data that you have seen in terms of being valuable when uncovering wrongdoing in a corporate investigation, or establishing that there was in fact no wrongdoing?
Sure. And I think you, as a foundational issue, you have to understand the company's systems for creating this data, creating this evidence, right? And having a thoroughgoing understanding of what the company's IT systems look like is a great place to start. We focus on IT because that's what we do. We do cyber investigations. We do consulting on electronic evidence. That data in any investigation is going to involve documents that are created by people, transactional documents, could be contracts, could be communications like emails, could be spreadsheets, really depends on what you're investigating, but the kinds of data that get created every single day by human users. It also is data which is created by machines, by computers. And the best example of that is metadata, file metadata, application metadata, which is the data which talks about what was done with those documents that were created by the human beings that created them. The format of this evidence, it's everything from Word documents and Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoints, email messages, and increasingly, and what we really like to focus on for a variety of reasons, is communications data over and above email. It's Teams messages, Slack messaging, direct messages on third-party platforms, WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, the kinds of applications that people have on their phones, which may not actually be applications which are sanctioned by, approved by the company, the employer in question.
Yeah, and you were very careful about how you were talking about this data. I figured it out, but I'm attuned to it. But for our listeners who might not be, you were talking about some of these platforms where communications take place, like Signal, like Telegraph, like WhatsApp, where the messages themselves aren't necessarily on the phone, which is used to create and receive the messages.
That's right. And increasingly, changes in operating systems for mobile devices are changing where it is we need to go look for messages, for attachments, for embedded objects in those messages. So where once all of the direct messages on SMS, short message format, multimedia message format, iMessages, they were all stored on the phone in encrypted databases on the phone. Now, some of those may be on the phone. Some of them may be in cloud backups. So you have to track changes in the operating systems from version to version in order to know where to go look. And it can be fairly challenging, actually, to go collect complete versions of this communications data.
Yeah. If your listener who wants to know more about this, there is a podcast I did recently with Jonathan Karchmer, where we talked about this very subject. And so if you go to idsinc.com and to the resources section, find our podcasts, where you can go to other places where you get your podcasts from. But this is not about Jonathan Karchmer. This is about Bill Taylor. And so sort of like what you did with the first part of my question, you kind of answered the second part of this question, but I'm going to ask it for you. What are some of the data sources that people aren't thinking about that can be crucial in investigations?
Well, I think there are a couple of them. Some of them are messaging platforms. Some of them are social media platforms that have direct messaging capabilities. For example, LinkedIn or Bloomberg Chat, X, formerly Twitter, WhatsApp, in particular, if you've got international investigations going on, because WhatsApp is so friendly for international communications, Microsoft Teams, Meta Messenger, Signal. I mean, I'm talking about a lot of applications, some of which may be officially sanctioned or whitelisted by a corporate employer, and some of which aren't. And when folks are using their personal devices under BYOD policies, bring your own device policies at companies, they're mixing approved applications, for example, email that they may have access to, or Teams that they may have access to on their phone, with applications, and it's easy to copy information from one application to another information and readily and freely mix communications which are part of their work with, and move it on to applications which are not sanctioned by their work, which are no longer under the control of work. And that's a problem from a number of perspectives, not just the perspective of fully capturing potentially relevant communications for an internal investigation in the corporate setting, but also how companies protect their intellectual property and proprietary information. It's just BYOD policies are a problem, and it's everywhere, right? Increasingly, during and after the COVID pandemic, companies began, who hadn't previously adopted BYOD policies, did it. And with remote work,
in some cases, they had to.
Right. Couldn't conduct business without them. So it's a reality. And as internal investigators just need to understand that and need to broaden their perspective in terms of where to go to identify and collect potentially relevant business communications.
Okay, great. So you, when we talked about what are corporate investigations, we talked about, the company needing to do an investigation or wanting to do an investigation because they believe something went on, perhaps. You also mentioned the government investigations. And so there are times where essentially the employee may not know that someone's coming. And there are times where it's as if the company or the government is wearing a Coach Prime t-shirt that says, we coming. Go Buffs. All right, there's one. I got one reference in,
There's
Bill.
one. Yeah, I think you said
okay.
what, Go Buffs? Yeah, okay.
Go.
Yeah, no, I know. I just want to,
Buffs.
I'm translating for non-Colorado Buffalo.
Yeah, sorry. For the non-Colorado folks, that would be the combination of Let's Go Buffs, Colorado Buffaloes, University of Colorado Buffaloes. All right, so in some cases, the employee may know it's happening. In some cases, they may not. In some cases, the company may not know government's coming. They may suspect it. But the reality is that business goes on. And business, it's a fast-paced environment, right? So if that's the situation, can you share how, in your mind, data analytics can expedite the investigative process and identify red flags sooner rather than later?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to understand the expectation of the end user of internal investigations. And in the corporate setting, the end user of an internal investigation is going to be governance bodies inside the company. It's going to be the board of directors, or it's going to be management. But in terms of the overall picture, one has to realize that federal agencies and potentially the Department of Justice may be the ultimate end user of these investigations. And it's really clear federal agencies now expect that robust compliance programs are going to have policies governing the use of personal devices and third-party messaging platforms, that they're going to have the ability to go capture that data in the context of investigations, and that they're going to be conducting thorough investigations in good faith, designed actually to get to the bottom of what happened. And it's just critically important to be able to go in, identify, and preserve data, which is created by people involved in the conduct that may be violative of company policies, laws, or regulations. And the way that the way that you have to do that, really, to ensure the admissibility of this evidence for folks who may be gathering it for legal proceedings. I'm talking again about the end users, regulatory agencies, prosecutors. If they can't admit the evidence at the end of the day, the company's not going to get credit for any cooperation with an investigation. So having folks like iDS who can go in, employ best practices, go preserve forensically without damaging the admissibility of this evidence for future proceedings is incredibly important. Self-collections are a bad idea. You have to collect not just the content that was created by users, but you have to collect the file metadata. This is nothing new. This has been true for a long time. What's increasingly challenging is collecting this from platforms that are changing, and that forensic best practices may be changing. And you really need people who are up to date on how things are changing in order to capture all of the data that may be relevant.
Yeah, it's a great point about the collection, the defensibility, the collection that went on. You've now collected all this data. You've got a ticking clock. You've got 48 hours before you want to turn something over to the government. No way in the normal course you're going to be able to look at every piece of data, every document. So is that when you start applying data analytics to speed the process up?
Yeah, there has just been a revolution in the last several years, and the pace of that revolution is increasing with the development of AI tools in the ability to analyze large sets of data quickly in order to gather facts and to cut the time to insight about what the conduct that's under investigation, and whether or not you're preparing to turn data over to the government or to reveal the results of a corporate internal investigation, or whether you're just planning on talking for the very first time to a regulator about the subject matter of the investigation. The more you know, the better position you're in. And I am certainly a proponent of doing what I call holistic or integrated or fusion analytics, which is analyzing data from every source. Not, you want to read transactional documents, you want to look at emails, but you also want to look at comms data to the extent that you can get it to find out what people were thinking and doing. And there are increasingly available analytical tools that we use in the digital forensics business to quickly cut through and figure out what's going on, figure out who is involved in the conduct. Because as you learn about who's involved in the conduct, you're identifying additional repositories of potentially relevant data. And
Sure,
the clock is always ticking. You want to get there quickly while the data still exists. And most importantly, there's a bunch of data which isn't created by the user, but which is very probative of what users were doing and potentially why they were doing what they were doing, that is ephemeral. It disappears. Logging data for particular systems disappears. Deleted emails, which may be recoverable for a period of time, disappear. And the timeframes we're talking about for this kind of ephemeral data, it's weeks, or a month. It's not months or years. And if you sit on your hands and don't go collect this data as soon as you reasonably can, the government, the regulators can begin to ask questions about why it is you didn't move more quickly to gather data, which may be highly probative of the conduct and the intent of the people involved in the conduct in question.
Yep. All right. So you just talked about data that is ephemeral, can go away, not even intentionally, right? Perhaps there's a way you could stop the systems from overwriting the data or extend the retention period of the data. But I know in conversations you and I have had, there's another way that data might disappear, and that is when somebody suspects that they're investigated, right? Right? Am I right on this?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, there's an entire exception to the Fourth Amendment warrants clause called exigent circumstances, which tells law enforcement officers if they think the evidence is going to be destroyed, they can step in and without a warrant go search and seize evidence that they would otherwise need a warrant for. Well, that's a recognition of a very human problem and objective reality. And corporate internal investigators have the same problem. People who think they're under investigation begin, times to go destroy data. Sometimes, by the way, there's no malignant intent. It's not that they're attempting to cover their tracks. Sometimes they think, oh gosh, I have something that I'm not supposed to have. Not that I'm covering my tracks. I know that I'm not supposed to possess this, so I'm going to dispossess myself of it. Right? I mean, you can have intentional conduct, which isn't, the intent behind wanting to divest yourself of possession of something isn't to protect yourself from potential punishment. It's just to get rid of something you're not supposed to have.
Right. So let's move on to my fifth question, maybe even sixth.
You're welcome to ask as many as you want.
As long as I get you to answer something beyond the fourth, I've won. Thank you.
Right.
Okay.
You have me now.
So what we just talked about was an element of human behavior. So I want this next question to kind of involve the people side of this. How do you integrate what I would consider to be human intelligence and traditional investigative techniques with data analysis to build a comprehensive picture of what happened?
So human intelligence is a term that you and I have used. Lots of folks don't maybe know what that is. That's
fair.
That's an intelligence community term of art, which means information which is obtained from human sources. In the context of a corporate internal investigation, generally what that means is the results of interviews that are conducted of company employees or third parties outside the company with knowledge of the subject matter under investigation. And I think what I will say about human intelligence, and I started my career in human intelligence with the military, interrogating war prisoners. That was my job. That the kinds of information that you get from human sources tends to explain other information that you gather from electronic sources. At trials, witnesses take the stand to talk about what happened. Trials are not just conducted with competing wheelbarrows full of documents. You need people to narrate what happened because at the end of the day, what you're talking about is human conduct. I think the trick in internal investigations, internal corporate investigations, is constantly updating your understanding of the facts under investigation. And the core of operative fact at the nucleus of your investigation with information that you're receiving from human beings. As you're asking corporate witnesses about the documents and about the data that you're finding, and as you're refreshing their recollection about events that may have occurred some time ago. And it's I think a mistake that we see sometimes is that those two efforts, gathering information from people and gathering data, are held separate too long. I think you have to take the information from these human folks and fold it into the investigation as quickly as you can. And one of the exciting capabilities that has been brought forward by these new analytical tools, and in particular, analytical tools powered by artificial intelligence, is the ability to quickly fold that information into a larger data set, query that data set to understand what people are telling you day by day as the investigation continues, and how that new information sheds light on the information that you had before you conducted the interview. I just don't. There have never been tools available now, before like there are now, to do this iterative approach, constantly updating your understanding based on the new information you're receiving from live witnesses.
Well, I want to expand on what you said as well, which is you talked about the importance of getting the human intelligence first and then querying perhaps the digital evidence, the data. I think there are times also where you want to leverage analytics to look at that data before you start talking to some of the humans, right? Because some people lie intentionally, some people lie don't intentionally lie. Can't think of the right word. It's there, tip of my tongue.
They get things. They make mistakes. They get things wrong. Yeah.
It's some people. It's what they remember, and our memories can be flawed. It's what they think you want to hear, or it's what they want you to hear, right? And so, in some cases, being able to use data to understand context before you start launching into either content review or interviews of people is just as important as the talk to the person first, then look at the data or start looking at other data sources.
Yeah, and understand it is a constant back and forth between data and witnesses. Ideally, you don't want to talk to a witness before before you've had a chance to read documents and communications that the witness has created, because you don't want to give the witness an opportunity to tell you something that isn't true. By the same token, and maybe being more, trying to be more fair to a witness. Look, particularly with events that are remote that occurred in the past, witnesses forget things, and you want to have documents available to refresh a witness's recollection so that they can give you the best version of what they actually are able to recall. And refreshing recollections of a witness with documents is a great way to do that. It really is. Yeah, I mean, my preference is to go in to an initial interview, an internal investigation, and be able to show the witness documents that the witness authored, documents that you think the witness has knowledge of, for personal knowledge of. I don't want to show a witness documents that I think he's never seen before, right? And it's to do both things. It's to refresh the witness so you get good information, and it's to make sure that the witness, isn't going to be telling you stories because they think that you don't know anything. And I've had situations where witnesses. I've had documents and have been able to ask witness control questions. That is, questions I already know the answer to, or at least I think I do, because I've got some document which may reflect on the veracity of an answer given by a witness, right? And if they step out of line, if they tell you an answer that you think is wrong based on what you think you already know, you confront them with that evidence. I have actually had witnesses tell me in my investigator colleagues, well, I guess you don't already know anything. I might as well tell you the truth. Again, it's for both purposes. It's to refresh people, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is get accurate information, both so the company can manage its own risk, but also so any information that you get that you may give to regulators or prosecutors is accurate in the first instance. I mean, the last thing you want to do is walk an otherwise cooperative witness into a bad situation by asking them about things that they haven't had a chance to refresh their recollection about. Have them make a mistake and tell you something which turns out not to be true, what they thought was true at the time, because their memory hadn't been refreshed.
Yeah,
it's a constant balance, and I think in fairness, you want to give a witness the opportunity to tell the truth by refreshing their recollection where it's required. If you're talking about things that happened yesterday, right? That's not the same thing, but it's the rare situation in business where you're talking about things that happened yesterday.
Yeah, unless you're going to ask me questions about yesterday, Bill, in which case I may not remember. And so I would want you to refresh my recollection.
Well, I'm no spring chicken myself, so I resemble that remark.
That's great. I love that. Okay. Before I move on to the last question, I do want to talk about DOJ specifically. And because I understand that within the past couple of years, DOJ changed their approach to investigations. And so I thought it would be important for our listeners to hear from you what that change was and why it's important.
Yeah, about a year ago, there was a change in DOJ policy, and now the express policy is that DOJ is going to give corporations more cooperation credit for corporate internal interviews and for cooperation with government investigations if good faith efforts were made to go collect and preserve relevant evidence in the form of data from personal devices of people involved in the conduct. And in particular, data generated from messaging platforms, both internal to the company and third-party messaging platforms. And my personal view of that, now this isn't DOJ's view. I don't speak for DOJ. My personal view of that is because there's recognition that that's where the most probative evidence is located.
Right.
And I think that just evinces an understanding that that people who are doing things in violation of company policies or law or regulation have learned not to put that stuff in email. They're putting it in what they think are more ephemeral, less easily accessible applications, right? In recent cases, DOJ has actually given more credit to company internal investigations or to corporations when they conduct investigations, and they've taken steps to preserve the data. Yeah.
Huh. I did not know that. Learning something new every day with you, Bill.
Well, and by the way, I learned that from various people that I work with in industry, and we're constantly watching to see whether standards are changing, among the end users. And the end users, again, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on, your point of view, are potentially regulators and prosecutors, right? And it is the job of any good faith investigation to gather information, to accurately determine what the root cause is, and to accurately determine what the role of people may have been in for the company's internal policies and for law enforcement purposes. So there's a huge premium to be earned and a huge penalty to be avoided by going and timely preserving and identifying data that's relevant. And I think the DOJ recognizes that's communications data, and it exists now on platforms which, some are easy to capture and some are not easy to capture. So our philosophy has always been to go gather this data. I think the philosophy of many regulators and federal prosecutors in particular has been to gather this data, but now it's become express policy, which is apparent both in policy documents authored by the department and in case studies of corporations that have cooperated with investigations in the recent past.
Very interesting. Okay, so here we are. Last question of this podcast. Data landscape is constantly evolving. We've talked about it in terms of operating systems. We've talked about it in terms of messaging platforms and how they handle messages. So what exciting advancements do you see in the future of data analytics in the context of corporate investigations?
Well, I think the most exciting development technologically is the advent of artificial intelligence assisted analysis of data sets. The ability to take large language model AI engines and focus them on discrete data sets in order to identify really quickly trends and patterns in data, to identify core sets of documents at the nucleus of conduct that you're investigating, to identify custodians, that is, people inside companies whose data ought to be preserved and analyzed, and again, to update those findings in an iterative approach, to be factoring in, to be constantly adding new information that is gathered in the investigation. And these platforms allow groups of investigators, teams of investigators, to share that intelligence and the updates and the fruits of that synthetic integrated fusion analysis in ways that just weren't possible before. It's very exciting to see what's becoming available in terms of AI-powered analytical tools.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thank you, Bill, for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. Yeah, looking forward to the next one.
All right, Jonathan, take care.
Yeah, I'd like to also thank our regular subscribers, those that may be first-time listeners as well, for spending time with us. If you'd like to learn more about iDS or want to subscribe to our iDS Talks podcast, you can visit idsinc.com or go wherever you normally get your podcasts from. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to talking more about data with you in our next edition of iDS Talks.